Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this professional learning opportunity. I am Scott Mathias from NCEA, and I will be your host today. Just a few housekeeping notes as people are joining. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A or chat windows. We will be monitoring the questions and will try to answer them all in the allotted time. After today's webinar, I will email everyone a link to the recording as well as an online survey. Once you fill out the survey, a certificate of completion for the webinar will be emailed to you. Today's webinar, How to Help Students Deal with Stress and Distress, is being led by Dr. Rich Gilman, President of Terrace Metrics. Before I turn it over to our presenter, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, thank you for all the blessings you have bestowed upon us. We are truly grateful for them. Thank you for allowing us today to meet and share our knowledge and time with one another in this webinar. May you extend your divine wisdom to our presenter so that he will be able to impart his knowledge to all of us. May he be blessed as he continues to bring his expertise to people who need it. Bless the participants as well so that they will be able to glean the vital information from this webinar. May we go out and spread what we learned in the spirit of your love and generosity. In Jesus' name, amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Rich, thank you for joining us today.
It's an honor. It's an honor. So we'll take it from here. And thank you so much for attending. I know, especially with the summer, you have the break, you have so many things that you're, involved with and enjoying, and taking a time out, that means a lot. I really appreciate it. This is meant to be, of course, a webinar, but it's also going to be hands-on. Scott has sent out, I believe, the handouts. You should have received a couple of handouts. This is part of a book that we have. It's not even a Terrace Metrics book. It's coming out in the fall. It's being published by PESI, which is the largest mental health publisher in the world. And this book is specific for those who work with students individually in schools. And so I'm going to show you some techniques throughout the course of this hour that you can use not only to your students, but for yourself. And it's all based on this thing called cognitive behavioral therapy. We'll talk about this in a second. You don't have to be a therapist. In fact, the book is specifically written for those who don't really have a therapy background. But nonetheless, we are all working with students in real time on a daily basis who are struggling with anxiety or stress or distress. And the purpose of today, and I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here, is to walk you all through what we're talking about when we say stress and distress, and certainly how to work with not only students, but maybe ourselves when we're finding our stress. I'm going to show you some data as we go through that are relevant to you as educators, because it was collected from educators. But let's talk about this idea of what wellness is, because there's a big push, of course, in schools today about this idea of wellness. Until the late 1940s, well within our grandparents' lifetimes, health really was a dichotomous thing. Either you were healthy or you were unhealthy. And think about during the times in the 1940s, what we lacked. We lacked, of course, sufficient sufficient things like polio vaccines, or even medications that can help us with certain sicknesses. And so really, it was a matter of life or death. Either you were unhealthy or healthy. Well, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, we've now been able to develop a number of scientific progresses, which allows us to think beyond healthy versus unhealthy. And in fact, what we know now is that when we think about wellness, wellness is not a yes, no, either or, it's a continuum. And the continuum is something like this. You could either be real on the negative end of the continuum, where there's a lot of issues that are happening, but there's also on the positive end, and this is this optimal functioning. And it's important to know that each step along this continuum is associated with different outcomes. Well, that started really in the 1950s, this drive to really fully capture when we say wellness. And from that time, we've been thinking about these sociological approaches. More importantly, all of these movements throughout these decades has really been focused beyond what the environment does to us, but how we act on the environment. That's the key. So in the 1980s to the 2000s, it's really how do we perceive our world around us? How do we take information in? How do we process it? Which governs our behaviors? And that's only started about 30, 40 years ago. But here's the thing with our students, it really only started in the 2000s, where our increasing focus was not just on the academic outcomes, but the whole child approach. That was really in the 2000s. And that led to a number of great movements that are out there. And you've heard these. PBIS is one, SEL movement is another one. And they're all fantastic movements. What they have done is they've really taken this lens and have focused on what is going well with the student. And that's great. But the drawback of some of these movements is now we're really focusing too much on the well-functioning students, and we're not focusing enough on those students who are struggling, often in silence. And so what's happened is it's created a dichotomy, even in the continuum, where we're focusing too much on the strengths and not enough on what is the student really struggling with. And so we can't assume wellness from just knowing one end of that continuum. We have to know the full end of the continuum, because there are many students who could be seen as reasonably well, but they're still struggling with adversity or stress of some kind. Even if they are not struggling with adversity now or stress now, if we don't know the strengths that they have, they might be vulnerable to those effects. And so we have to look at the total continuum when we're thinking about students' wellness. That is actually the science of resiliency. Resiliency is kind of like the next movement. All right, so we got PBIS, we got SEL. Now we're moving into the science of resiliency, which has always been around, but it's really been embraced in schools today. And what science of resiliency says is, all right, let's take a look at these strengths. Are they at a sufficient level to protect ourselves against adversity? If we have certain strengths that are a sufficient level, then we are more successfully able to overcome or work through adversity. If they are not there any longer, they have eroded or they're just missing, that's when we are most vulnerable to the effects of stress and adversity. So we have to look at both sides. We have to improve the strengths in order to protect against adversity. And that science of resiliency is a framework that we use at Terrace Metrics with behavioral health. Behavioral health looks at both sides. And the goal, of course, is to promote those strengths in order to protect against adversity when it rears its ugly head. And I'm underscoring the word when, because we are creatures of adversity. That's what defines who we are as individuals. I don't see any of you on, but I would imagine you don't even need to raise your hand, but think of your own life. How many of you have never faced adversity? Of course, none of you would raise your hand. We all have adversity, but the students who are able to successfully work through or overcome that adversity or that stress associated with adversity, there's a huge learning or a huge curve in what happens after they graduate from school. What about those students who don't? And that's the key, because if we can identify the behavioral health of every student, we are able to not only help them with their intrapersonal functioning, but also with their academic functioning. Those students who are struggling with some forms of adversity that's causing distress in their lives right now, they're struggling also with their academic functioning. If we can promote behavioral health, if we can address and promote those strengths so they can address their adversity, we're able to also improve their academic functioning. And that is the key for today. Because of the effects of the pandemic, among others, that has magnified what we already known about our students in our schools. Think of this whole mantra of 1 in 5. 1 in 5 students are currently experiencing some significant level of stress or distress. Now, it's not diagnosable. So I'm a psychologist, I'm a licensed psychologist. That's not a diagnosable, but it's stress nonetheless. And that stress can be interfering with their ability to learn. And that's the goal, of course, for us in schools. Here's the key: of those students who are currently struggling with some form of significant stress or distress, 2 to 3 of them go undetected. And that's the key. We're not very good connectors, observers of individuals who are struggling, because they tend to keep them themselves. Anxiety, stress, distress, that's an intrapersonal thing. They don't really want to show that with anyone. And so the idea is we have to wait for that problem to come to our attention. When that problem does come to our attention as educators, often it takes up to 10 years for that to happen. And that happens then is that that problem that first emerged, which caused the distress, may become more intractable, much more difficult to address. So what we want to do is we wanted to give tools back to educators so when you do start to sense that the student's under distress of some kind, we can teach them tools then so that they can learn themselves. But I'm going to use this as the lens to do this today. So you have some handouts, and what we're going to show you, what I am going to show you, is how to use them with yourself. And then you can certainly use the same skills when you're identifying a student, perhaps in your classroom, who's been struggling with some sort of stress or distress. Look, the problem's not going to go away. And this is our own data of thousands of students who have completed our system for the first time. Now, these numbers don't mean, these are mean scores. They don't mean much, but let me put it in context. So the anxiety measure that we use and the depression and the ostracism, they have cut points because they're often used in clinics. And cut points for the anxiety and the depression are 8. That means that if a student completes the same indicator we use in a clinic, if I'm a clinician and he or she scores an 8, that's more than likely going to warrant further interventions to help that student. What you're seeing here is a general sample of students. These are not students who have been identified to come to a clinic. These are just our students. And as you can see, collectively speaking, their levels of distress through forms of anxiety or depression are very high, almost at an 8. Now, each one of these years is a school or a district that has used the system for the first time. So this is absent of any interventions. This is just time one. The ostracism, I should say, which is the biggest predictor of distress in students, believe it or not, it's the biggest predictor. That cut point is 2. So anything above 2 suggests that they're really struggling with being perceived as either being ignored or actively excluded. So again, in both sides, high schools and middle schools, for example, they're really high. So the problem is continuing to grow. The pandemic has magnified that. So let's talk a little bit about how we identify stress and what role does it play in day-to-day activities. Well, first of all, let's separate. Not all distress is bad, and not all stress is bad, I should say. There are actually good forms of stress, and we know this. We don't really perform our best unless we have a little bit of stress to help motivate us. And that's the key. We call that S-stress. And so it's not all forms of stress are bad. In fact, data shows clearly that if we don't have some sort of stress to motivate us, we don't perform our best. It helps us focus. It doesn't really last long. We kind of use those butterflies to our advantage. However, there's that other side, and that's distress. Distress means it can be overwhelming. It's basically taxing whatever strengths we have. And by doing that, what's happening is it's actually decreasing performance. The other thing we need to know about stress is the difference between stress and anxiety. Stress is typically just a response to a threat or a situation. It's relatively temporary. I'm under some stress, and we're pretty good about identifying what that stressor is. And we're able to kind of develop some skills to work through the stress. Again, it's temporary, but ongoing forms of stress that sometimes aren't tied to a specific thing that we can be that we are aware of, that can lead to anxiety. So anxiety is a reaction to ongoing stress, and that can lead to not only sustained mental health issues, but also physical health issues too. So there's a difference between stress and anxiety. We're going to focus on the distress end of the stress continuum. We're not really going to focus on anxiety because that's more of a, that would warrant further intervention from somebody like me or someone else with a background in this area. So we're going to focus for educators on the distress side of stress. Now, what is the impact of stress over time? Let's talk about what's happening in all of our brains when we are under forms of distress. And I'm giving you a picture of the brain, of course. And there are 3 areas of the brain that I really want us to focus on. So we're kind of peeling away the onion when we think about distress. There are physiological reasons why we feel the way we feel, why we think the way we think. And it first starts here under 1. This is this little brain stem of ours. Now, you can do this at home. You can take your finger, just go up your spine, And right where the spine meets the back of your head, that's the brainstem. Now, the brainstem is often overlooked or ignored, but it is one of the most important parts of our brain, because if you damage this, you're essentially dead. It's responsible for all these things we don't even pay attention to, our breathing, our body temperature. But the biggest thing it's responsible for is searching for threats. So that's the brainstem. And let's say, for instance, you're driving today, you're going to the grocery store, and you've done that route 1,000 times. You're not even thinking about driving to the grocery store. You might be doing other things or talking to someone, but your brain is conditioned and programmed to go to the store because it knows that route. But let's say today on your way to the store, about 2 blocks up, you see a red car, and a red car is going to be intersecting you. It's going very fast. The first thing you will do is not react to the car. The first thing you're going to do is notice the car, because that is something it's new for you. It's unique. You don't know what's going to happen. When you notice that car and you gauge that car is going fast and you could hit it, it's an instantaneous reaction and engages your fight, flight, or freeze response. That starts right here. What this means is that now you have to take an action. Now that's 2 blocks up and the car's going. So you've got plenty of time to commit an action, right? Whether it's to pump the brakes, whether it's just to slow down, you've got time to do this. And you've also got time to process that information. So in response to a stressor that you can kind of anticipate, you're able to kind of make a behavior in response to that. No, but let's say, for instance, it's not 2 blocks away, it's 50 feet away, and it's coming at you fast. You have no time to think. That fight, flight, freeze is still going to react. You're going to react. You won't even think about it. You're just going to react. That thing is coming right at you. And what's going to happen in that moment is that there's going to be an impulse that's being sent from your brainstem to a very small part of your brain, about halfway down, about 6 inches. And don't do this at home, but if you take a pencil and about halfway down from the top of your head, you're going to hit it. It's about the size of a quarter of your thumbnail. It's very small. That's the amygdala. That's where our emotions are processed. What is happening in the time when that red car is coming rushing at you is there is a huge impulse that's being shot from your brainstem to your amygdala. And that's where our emotions are processed. So think about what emotions you would experience in that moment when the car's coming directly at you. You don't have to say it, but I would imagine it's probably fear, might be anger. I can't believe this is happening, but it's an emotion nonetheless. Now, depending on how this is responding to this, which is basically a buzzer, it's going bzzz, it's going to carve a channel to that emotional center. Therefore, because that carve is there, let's say, for instance, thankfully, that car has stopped in time and it did not hit you. And so tomorrow you go back to the school and you're driving along, and about a block up, you see the red car. You see another red car. It's not the same red car. What are you inclined to do? Well, I can't see you, but what you're most inclined to do is experience the same emotion, because the day prior, that type of red car almost caused you to hit it, and it created an emotional flood. You're going to experience that again, even though the car is a block away. It's not even going fast. It's not doing it. It's just a red car. But what has happened is you have now conditioned yourself to respond to that stressor. Hopefully that makes sense. In both cases, in time one, when this happened, when your brainstem really started to buzz and it caused this to happen, there was one final step in this equation. And that was from your emotions to this part of your brain right here, the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe is the most important. It's really what defines us as human beings. It's the frontal lobe. It's our thinking center. It really is the boss of everything else. And so when we have a problem, we want to solve the problem. We use our frontal lobe. But if you've ever been so emotionally distraught or fearful or angry or whatever you want to call it, where you couldn't even spell your name correctly, that's what's happening. What's happening is that your emotions have hijacked this part of your brain. It's told it to shut down. And that's what happened in that red car incident yesterday. You're driving along, the car almost hits you. You don't even think. You tell yourself something, but that's not really a thought. because what has happened is that the emotions got so powerful, you were forced to respond and not think. By the way, that's not a bad thing. That's an evolutionary kind of a tool that we've learned over time. And the reason is that there are sometimes when we should not be thinking, we should be reacting. You are in a jungle and a lion is chasing after you. The worst thing you can possibly do as the lion is chasing you is to think whether you should go this way or whether you should go that way. That small little amount of time is enough for the lion to catch up to you. So there are times when you don't want to be thinking. If you're an athlete, maybe you played baseball, what's the worst thing you can possibly do when you're standing at home plate? Think about what the pitch is coming. That slows you down. So there's plenty of times in our lives when we don't want to think. But there are other times when we should be thinking and we're not, because our emotions are controlling us. So I'm using the red car as an example of a physical threat, right? That physical threat is always going to take precedence because the number one instinct that we all have is self-preservation. Even reproduction is number two. Our number one instinct is self-survival, and it starts here. So whenever we start seeing that red car, for example, until we kind of overcome it, that emotion is going to hijack this frontal lobe, and we're going to be just a ball of emotions, and that's what's guarding our behaviors. So far, so good. But let's think about this. Most of our threats are not physical threats. On a daily basis, we don't have a red car coming at us. We have other types of threats. And these are more what we call psychological threats. They're rules that get violated. And I'll talk about this in just a second. But here's the thing about our brainstem. Our brainstem doesn't know whether it's a physical or a psychological. It just sees threat as a threat. So anytime we are threatened, either physically, which hardly ever happens, but much more psychologically, a violation of our rules, we get upset. And that's because the frontal lobe is thinking threat, threat, threat. And it's going to link to our emotional center. Our emotional center could get so big that it tells our frontal lobe to shut down. And that is what we're seeing with our students in real time. When you're seeing a student who's like really upset or anxious or whatever else, what's happening is that in real time, it's a threat to them in some way. And they're responding to a threat just like you or I would be to that red car. Their emotions have gotten too much for the students. And they're not thinking about their solutions. They're not thinking about options to work their way out of at that moment. You've seen this happen if you're a parent. You've seen plenty of times with your own child. Your child is so upset in some way that you're trying to talk to them and they're not even listening to you. And the reason is they can't listen to you because they're a ball of emotions. The goal of what we are trying to do when we are working with our students is we've got to get them to fire this thing up. Even in situations when it's shutting down, we've got to get the frontal lobe activated again so they can control their emotions rather than having their emotions control them. And I hope that makes sense. So it's only 3 areas, but those 3 areas are very powerful. So let's walk through. When we talk about stress, well-modulated response is simply this. The threat comes, right, brainstem, hits the amygdala, our emotional center. Our emotional center says, emotions. That sends a response to our frontal lobe. But here's the key. We keep the frontal lobe on. We keep it activated. We think through the problem. We are able to do that. And by doing that, by keeping this activated, basically what is happening then is it tells the amygdala, it's not a threat, shut down. And by doing this, it stops the brainstem from buzzing. Make sense? So what we're trying to do is keep the frontal lobe firing so that we can control our emotions. If we can control our emotions, we get the brainstem to quit buzzing and we're back to square one. We can think through the solutions. But the heightened stress response is different. And here's what's happening. Remember that second day of the red car? Most of the time when we have a threat, it's not time 1. Maybe we've had a threat similar to that in our past. We don't even know what that is. But that was an unconditional, right? That first day of red car, that's an unconditional trigger because we didn't see it coming. But that day 2, when we saw that red car didn't even have to be the same car, that's a conditioned response now. And that's behavioral. What this means is that it doesn't have to be the same car. Any red car is going to take its place. And we're going to be conditioned to respond in kind. And that's what's happening when we are stressed. There's a trigger, that second day of red car. It's going to trigger our amygdala. Our amygdala is going to tell our brainstem, hey, it's going to do that. And it's going to tell our frontal lobe to shut down. And it's always, not always, but it'll continue to be this way until we develop skills ourselves to control our emotions. And that's the key, what we're going to be doing here in about 5 minutes. But the physiological changes due to high stress is profound. And we know this through decades of research. And it's not just self-reports, there's MRIs, fMRIs. Here's one for you. We do this ourselves. So I'm out of Cincinnati. We have the University of Cincinnati here and the UC Stress Center, among other things. And so here's one. This is for post-traumatic stress. You may have heard of it. It's really anxiety on steroids, so to speak. And we've done some studies where we've taken the fMRI, which is functional magnetic MRI. And what it is doing is, rather than taking a picture, you're seeing things happen in real time. So we take individuals who are in their 60s and 70s, and they had something happen to them 50 years prior, before. Nothing has changed for them in that 50 years. So nothing else has happened. So we've put them in the fMRI and we ask them a simple question. Tell us what happened to you 50 years ago or beyond. And in the course of their explaining what happened to them even 50 years prior, half a century ago, you see the connections being made between the brainstem, the amygdala, and shutting down the frontal lobe. And it's because, again, the brainstem doesn't know what's real. It doesn't know what's a memory. It just sees threat. And so the idea is we've got to hijack that system, because what it does, even 50 years after, if we don't do this, it increases things that interfere with our ability to learn. For example, the biggest one that's out there is the stress hormone called cortisol. That suppresses our immune system, and that leads to downstream effects. And I'll show you in just a second. But more importantly for our students, sustained high levels of cortisol can disrupt areas of the brain responsible for learning and memory, even in our young students. So the longer that they are in distress and can't come up with coping mechanisms to kind of calm themselves down, that's a sustained level of cortisol that can disrupt their ability to learn. And that's the thing we want to do. Now, of course, it disrupts other things too, besides just the neurocircuitry. It certainly disrupts the social systems. It certainly creates long-term physical effects. So there's a whole ton of studies about what happens to adolescents under severe distress, untreated, and what happens after they graduate. It can lead to long-term distress. It can also lead to behavioral effects, a number of really ugly stuff that can happen because of this. By the way, I know we're talking about students. Let's talk about you, because that's more important, equally important to me. It's about the stress you've been facing for years, especially with the pandemic. We know this is that up to half of educators experience some form of distress. It's one of the highest of the professions. And in fact, the Gallup poll in 2020, I believe, did a survey, and they found the stress levels of educator at the same level as emergency room nurses. And these are nurses in emergency rooms when you don't know what's coming in. We're talking high levels here. We also know this for our schools, is that burnout is such a huge thing now. And in fact, 1/3 of our new teachers leave their jobs, leave the whole profession in the first 5 years. And the reason for that, 75% of the reasons why individuals leave their profession, it's a behavioral health concern. It's not that they easily handle their job, but the stress is associated with it. And of course, the distress among educators is directly linked to student achievement outcomes. And there's been a ton of studies in the past 5 years that have shown that the more stress that a teacher is under, of course, they can't really attend to their studies the way they want to, and that has a direct effect on learning opportunities and experiences for the students. I'm showing you some data that we have collected. So this is actually pre-COVID, 2019 data, where we compared, I think this was 300 educators across the United States to what we call comparison groups, non-educators. And to a T, you're seeing even pre-COVID, our educators are facing almost twice the percentage of anxiety as the comparison cohort. So if you're feeling under stress or have been, you may not know because it's the summer months, but please know you're not alone. It's out there and it's not going to get any better unless we address it. So what I want to do is we're going to walk through in the little time that we have here specific ways that you can help, your students, but also yourself reduce what we call toxic stress or distress. Toxic stress is that stress that's ongoing, it just keeps going. It's insipid. It affects everything. Let's talk about how we can address this. Well, first of all, I have this picture of the we call that oxygen that you see in the airplanes that pop up and they always give you the warnings. There is a reason why I'm calling you out first. It's because we have to take care of you. You have to take care of your own needs before you can take care of your students. So recognizing your own stress triggers is number one thing. What does cause you the stress? It sounds simple. You would think that we all know, but we're pretty poor reporters of our own stress triggers. We can get a couple, and here's what you can do. I'm not saying you need to do this, but to really enlighten yourself on your own stress triggers, talk to others who are very close to you, whether it's your significant other, whether it's your close friends, whether it's your children. And I do this all the time when I work with families. First thing I have you do is identify your stress triggers. What causes you stress and how do you show you're stressed? What are some of the behaviors that you do? That same question, I then ask the significant other or a friend if they come in, or even the children. And it is amazing how much we as individuals don't know about how we show stress and how we don't really recognize our own stress triggers. If you do that, I think it's going to be quite enlightening for you to get a 360 perspective, because there are some things you might be doing, you may not even know about it. But that leads to the second point, just the act of asking those questions freely. That's talking about it. And that's the most important thing, is communication is the key, is to don't keep things inside. That doesn't solve your problem. It's talking about it to others. And there has been a number of groups, especially educator groups that are now out there that are designed to kind of help each other navigate through these very stressful conditions we're in right now. But let's talk about some of the other things. And these are more behavioral. First of all, gotta get to sleep. You can do it now, but again, I can't see you, but I would have asked you, how long did it take after you got done with school, if you have the summer vacation, how long did it take before you finally got your sleep habits down to where you can get finally 8 hours, if you are, all things considered? Most of the time, it's going to take you some time to do that. Just because you leave the environment, it doesn't mean you stop reacting to the environment as if it's continuing to happen. It does take some time to kind of settle in. And that's because of this. This is the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, right? You may not be going to school, but your brain doesn't know that. It's still waiting for that stressor to come. Sleep habits are very important to get into to kind of help you modulate your stress reactions. If you're not getting 8 hours of sleep like you should, find ways to do this. And one of the ways is to think about the diets. And there's I'm not going to go into this because the key that we often think about with our diet is caffeine intake, right? Some of us like to drink Mountain Dew at 9 o'clock at night. And we claim that we're good sleepers in spite of the caffeine intake. Research suggests that's not true at all. Yeah, you might sleep, but you're not getting the quality sleep. Real quick, what I mean by quality sleep, it's REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is really what we need. So rapid eye movement, it increases over the course of the evening or overnight. Starts small, gets bigger and bigger and bigger as we go through our sleep stages. We go through about 2 or 3 sleep stages each night. And at the end of each of those stages, that's our rapid eye movement. So it gets bigger as we go on. Problem is we don't get that REM sleep. It doesn't matter if we get 8 hours of sleep. Without that REM sleep, we wake up lethargic, we're very tired, we're confused, among other things. So REM sleep is very important. Here's the problem. Caffeine interferes with the REM sleep. Sleeping pills interfere with the REM sleep. So there's some things that we do. Alcohol, another one, interferes with the REM sleep. Things that we can do to kind of think that we're going to get a quality sleep. We might be sleeping, but we're not getting the quality sleep. So be careful with that. about what you're taking, especially right before you go to bed, 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed. Be careful of what you might be taking at night. Melatonin, it seems to be fine, although there's some literature, but it's not the best of the literature, to be honest with you. But melatonin is a naturally occurring hormone that we produce. They call it the vampire hormone because it comes out at night. That doesn't seem, at least in small, very small doses, it does not seem to affect our REM sleep. But what I mean by small doses of melatonin, if you're taking that, that's less than a milligram. I mean, there's pills out there that are like 10 milligrams. That's too much. So again, you want to consult with your primary care physician, but really just start thinking about your dietary habits. That's the big one that helps improve your sleep. But let's talk about what else we can do when we are under stress. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you something, and then you're going to be able to train your students to do this, because I'll show you how to do this right now. So I can't see you. I can't see if you're going to do this. The only thing I can do is trust that you will. And this is, we recognize when we start feeling ourselves getting upset, right? The physiological symptoms, which is often what? The face flushing, the shallowness of breathing, tensing of the muscles, all of these things. Mine is usually the jaw clenching. We don't even recognize it. That's why interviewing our significant others, friends, even children are really important for them to tell us, what am I exhibiting when I'm under stress? But when we catch ourselves doing that, let's stop and do something. And this means stop it. Just stop and do this simple thing. So we're going to do it right now. Very simple, since we're already sitting. I want you to sit up, and I want you to do one thing, and that is relax and take a deep breath. Now, deep breath means you take as much air into your lungs as you possibly can. Do not hold it. Take it up until you can get no more in your lungs. It's almost like a balloon. Fill that balloon up as much as you can, and then let it out. The key is to feel discomfort. It doesn't have to hurt, but feel discomfort in your lungs. That means you've got a lot of air in there. So let's try this. Just take a deep breath. Make discomfort and let it out. Relax everything. Do it 5 times. Make it hurt. Make it discomfort. I used to say make it hurt, and then somebody said that's probably not a good thing. Sounds pretty sadistic. And I don't mean it like that. Make it discomfort, meaning get as much air in your lungs as you possibly can, and take 2 more breaths, and then let it out slowly. You don't have to be slow breathing in. It could be, but you got to make it hurt, and you have to just relax everything. If you want, focus on the breath that's coming in. Maybe pretend like it's your favorite smell, or focus on a light bulb. If you want to do that, close your eyes and just, as you're breathing in, your light bulb gets brighter, so that when your lungs can get no more air in, that light bulb is so bright you can't think about anything. You're just looking at that light. Then let it out, and keep doing that until you calm yourself down. Do 2 more. So why am I doing this? Why am I making you breathe until it's discomfort to you? Think about, again, the chain between your brainstem, your amygdala, and your frontal lobe. Your brainstem is going to respond to a threat. Not necessarily physical. Physical is always going to be that case, but a psychological threat. And it's going to start buzzing. Bzz, and it's going to link to your amygdala, your emotions. Your emotions could get so big that it causes this to shut down, in which case you're just a ball of emotions. And that's what we see in our students too. What we need to do is we need to hijack that process. And how you do this is you've got to figure out a way to get this thing to focus on something else. And that is where the discomfort comes from. Because when you are making your lungs discomfort, that brainstem, which is so simple, I mean, it's one of the most simple parts of our brain. Every organism basically has a brainstem. You can only focus on one threat at a time. So you want to get at the most proximal threat. So up to this point, it's been focusing on whatever threat you've manufactured or has been manufactured for you. You want to override that, calming yourself down and making your lungs discomfort. Now it's taking the brainstem to go, what's going on? And it immediately unhinges from the amygdala. It's focused on something else. And by doing that, you automatically get your frontal lobe back on. All of which is to say, when you work with a student, and we do this with the classrooms all the time, start your day off just with the deep breathing and take it seriously. It should not be fun. It should be a deep breathing technique, because what you can then do is that when you see a student who's really upset, really anxious or distressed, do not use your words. Your words are going in one ear and out the other. They're not listening to it because they're just emotional. What you want to do is just drop everything and let's breathe. Let's breathe until you can get them to calm down. Now their frontal lobe's back on. Now they can listen to you. And that's almost counterintuitive as we are as parents and certainly educators when we're trying to create a teachable moment. But when they're upset, that's not a teachable moment. So we want to create a time where we can be creative and teachable. And that is after we get them to calm themselves down. The more times you practice when they don't need it is going to be very important, so that they'll automatically use it when they do. So we use a lot of in our classrooms, in our schools that we work with, is that exactly this is what we do. Before we start any day, we start with the deep breathing. They're going to do 5 deep breaths. They're going to calm themselves down. We don't move on until they all have to calm down. And so it's just a trigger for us, a reminder for us. When we need to have the student use it, it becomes very automatic for them. Now, that's one simple way, but it's a very powerful way. But let's talk a little bit about how we put all this together, because what we normally don't really focus on is our perceptions of the threat to us. And we often take that threat as real. Doesn't matter what the threat is, we often assume it's real. A red car is real. Somebody calling us names, yes, it's a threat. It's a threat nonetheless. But sometimes, most of the time, there's a gray area. And what we are doing is we're taking what we perceive as a threat, we make it real, and we act upon it. So something happens, somebody tells us something, we observe something, and that's going to lead to strong feelings and negative thoughts. And that's going to lead to why a lot of us are not good at it, because what we try to do is that does not feel good. Let's not think about it. Let's avoid it. And that leads to escape avoidance behaviors. Hopefully that makes sense. So really, something happens, leads to strong feelings, emotions, thoughts, and that leads us to not want to do that. We try not to think about it. All right. So what you see here is some of the ways that we avoid. And that's we, I'm saying we, not just our students, all of us avoid. So I want you to think about this. What reactions do you typically have when you are under distress? You know, so what are these? Are they these or are they others? Just think through this. I'm only going to give you like 10 seconds, but this is important as we go to these handouts that were given to you. So how do you typically respond when you're in distress? Now, what we want to do, and the key to all this, you can't avoid. We have to address it. So the first thing, let's think about this amygdala. The amygdala is very simple. It's a very simple part of our brain. If you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, you'll know what I'm talking about. Those characters in that movie, Inside Out, those are the basic emotions. There's gradations, of course, but these are the simple emotions. And we are very good about identifying what our emotions are. And so are our students. Our students are very good about saying, "I'm mad." That's the thing. And that's where a lot of forms, we really want to focus on the emotions, for example. There's a lot of individuals who believe in that. That's not what cognitive behavioral tells us. So it's okay to focus on the emotions, but let's talk about what's leading to those emotions. And so you have an ABC sheet in front of you. We call it ABC. This is a very classic sheet. This is used probably since the 1950s. And so it's what it is, it's broken down to the different groups. Of course, A, something happens. We never have a behavior and an emotion in a vacuum. Something is going to occur. Now, whether that's our own thought or a memory, whether that's something that's acted upon us, it's an A, something is going to happen. And then we're really good about, okay, something happens, this is what I felt, but that's the end of the chain. What we want to know is, what are we telling ourselves? What is the statement we're making about what happened to us? That's the thing we're not very good at. What am I saying to myself at this point? We call that a roadblock. No, a roadblock, the reason I call it a roadblock, it's stopping us from solving the problem. So when we get upset, something happens, we tell ourselves something's pretty ugly, we feel something, and then we have a behavior, either avoid or approach, right? So C, feeling something, is at the end of the chain. In order to change how we feel about it, we got to first understand, what am I telling myself in this moment? So let's talk about, how do we identify and challenge these roadblocks that we have, these Bs. We're going to focus on the Bs. And so if you're not sure what your roadblock is, we have this thing called appear. What I want you to do for the next minute does not have to be a big thing at all. Let's go back to this sheet you have in front of you. I want you to think about something that caused you to feel upset of something. It doesn't have to be huge. It could be getting into a little tiff with your significant other. It doesn't have to be huge though. And I would like you to fill out your ABC sheet. What was it that happened? And it's probably easier for you to then go to C, tell you, well, okay, what was the feeling you had by that? But now I want you to think about, what did you tell yourself? And that's the roadblock I want you to focus on. Now, these roadblocks are something you told yourself. It's not what people told you. It's how did you interpret what they told you, for example, or how did you interpret the event? These roadblocks are, because your emotions are pretty strong, they're not fun statements you made. They're pretty ugly statements. We all have them. We all have them. They're ugly, bad statements that we tell about ourselves. And I want you to just select one. I'll give you a minute to do that. I have my timer on. All right. Many of us have a hard time understanding our roadblocks. This is something that we call it the appear framework. Remember that most of our threats in real life is not a physical threat. It's not a red car. It's something that has violated a rule we had. And these rules can be applied in this appear framework. And the reason we call it appear is that there are fundamental universal needs we all have. And when these needs are violated, that's what usually causes us to feel upset. So the appear is the need to achieve or personal belonging, right? The need to be accepted, the need for power or control over our actions, the need to feel secure in our identity, it's called esteem. The need to look good, which is, it's a good thing, but it's the need to give off a good impression or appearance, and the need to feel respected. And that is the sense of justice, right? So appear. Any one of our roadblocks is likely going to follow along one or more of those appear handouts. As an example, let's try and see if you can do this. Which appear is this? This is, my mom makes me do everything. What's that violating? Control and autonomy, power. Nobody likes me. Nobody likes you, then nobody's, you're not feeling like you're belonging to anything. So that's the personal belonging that's been violated. If I get a B on this test, I will not go to college of my choice. Sorry. That's the violation of the need for achievement. Do you see how it all fits? Then that's the important thing, because sometimes when we're working with our students, we may not know what they're upset about. It's like, what's the big deal? Well, for them, it is a big deal. If we can identify what rule that's being violated, then we can help them understand, how do I address that? How can I challenge this thought? So the key here is to, if you can remember the APPEAR acronym, it's going to fit somewhere. If we can get them to start thinking, I'm just interested right now. I know you have every right to be upset, but I just want to know, what are you telling yourself right now? That statement is going to fit along this APPEAR. And if you can get that, then you can go to the next stage. Best way to do this first is to have you start training yourself. Whenever you start feeling upset, What am I telling myself? And then which part of this APPEAR acronym is that fitting into? Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so let's do this one. This is the complete ABC sheet. This is an example. Parents tell me I'm not doing enough to help the child learn. I am not cut out for this, right? Which APPEAR is that one? Is it violating? I am not cut out for this. By the way, it could be multiple, doesn't have to be just one. And then, of course, that leads to anger and frustration. That's your emotions. That's your ABC sheets. That's the ABCs. If you're really interested in doing this, make copies of the ABC sheet. And for the next several days, just do ABCs. This really helps you identify, and you're probably going to find a pattern on your Bs, but you tell yourself anytime you feel upset. It doesn't have to be huge. It could be anytime you're feeling anger, frustration, whatever else. Let's think back. What are you telling yourself? Now, what we need to do is to start challenging our roadblocks. And that's the most important thing. This is the other sheet that you have, the other handout you have. And this handout walks you through identifying whether that roadblock is true or not. Remember, the roadblocks, when we tell ourselves these things, I'm stupid or whatever else, at that point, we really believe that, because why would we be telling ourselves this? We tell ourselves this because it's kind of a go-to little thing we have in our toolkit. Whenever we beat ourselves up, we use some of these really ugly roadblocks. Remember, we don't want to avoid, write it down, all right? So, in this case, whatever that roadblock was that you told yourself, that B, list it there. And what you're going to do now is use each one of these items. You're going to challenge the roadblocks. This is a classic cognitive behavioral technique. You don't have to be a therapist to do this. You can just do this yourself. And how we do this is through Socratic questioning. And Socratic questioning is something that is a skill that I wish we could teach more of, because of course, Socrates being around for as long as he was, as long ago as he was, it's still the number one thing we can kind of weigh the evidence for and against. And the evidence is, I need to underline that, evidence for, not, these are facts. These are not thoughts or because I'm telling myself. There has to be evidence that supports whatever that roadblock is, for and against. We are really good about looking at evidence for. My best friend hates my guts. Well, we got in a fight 2 weeks ago, and we're throwing up all this historical stuff as evidence for that fact. Problem is, there's tons more evidence against. It's not talking ourselves out of it. It has to be facts. But we often ignore the facts that refute what we tell ourselves this. So what we're trying to do with the sheet, it's okay to list evidence for. List as much evidence. It's got to be evidence. It's got to be admissible in the court of law. So the idea is, let's use an example, right? If I get a B in this class, I'm not going to be able to go to the college of my choice. Well, what's the evidence for? Maybe my mom told me. I looked at the GPA on the website, and getting too many B's, I'm not going to be there. So there could be evidence for, specific pieces of evidence for. Great. What you're going to find, either when you do this yourselves or you want to use this in some way with your students, there's not a lot of evidence for. I mean facts. It's not a lot of facts. You might have one or two that support that. More importantly, you want to spend as much time as possible on evidence against that suggests that's not really true what you're telling yourselves. So for example, if I get a B in this course, I'm not going to go to the college of my choice, right? Well, yes, my mom told me that. Okay, is my mom down here? Is this a reliable source? Has your mom always been right? No. Okay, so that's one. So evidence against is my mom is not always right. Did your mom go to that college? No, she did not go to the college. Okay, evidence against. My mom didn't even go to that college. How would she know? Another one is, okay, I get a B. If you looked at the GPA online, was that a 4.15 average? No, the average typically is much less than that. which means that many students who have gone to that college get Bs. That's a fact against that roadblock. Hopefully that makes sense. You're trying to flip it. You're trying to find and stick with as many evidences against as you possibly can. Here's the one that we have for the ABC sheets, right? The parents don't think I'm doing enough to educate their children during the pandemic, right? Some parents have emailed me these statements, and I'm really focusing on those parents. Well, evidence against is actually I've received other emails that have said the opposite, that I'm doing so much. I've forgotten about that. So we want to balance this. The other thing is we work through, once we get the for and against, that opens up doors for us to consider, that's not really true what I'm telling myself. And so what evidence are you not considering? Is it's like, it keeps going down. Does a roadblock include pretty drastic all or none terms? Yes, yes. When I'm an idiot, that's an implied, I'm an idiot all the time. That's not true, right? There are plenty of times when I did things absolutely correct. Let me list those. So the goal here is to just get you or the student to start considering the entire perspective around them, not just the statement that they tell themselves. Here's one for students. And this is something that you can do yourself. And here's the roadblock. If I say something wrong when the teacher calls on me, people will think I'm weird. What could be evidence for that? You can make it up yourself. Maybe it was the teacher called on me, last week and Joey wrinkled his nose at me. Or it could be anything. So you want to list as much evidence for as you possibly can. It'll likely be one or two. And then you want to focus on, all right, giving you that chance now, let's flip this. What is the evidence against the fact that people think you're weird? Well, the evidence against is Joey said his nose was itchy, or the other ones were, two classmates really liked what I said, or something. They're proud that I was brave enough to say it, or whatever else. There's going to be evidence against the fact that it is. It's not talking the student out of it. It's weighing. And what we're trying to do is to get this frontal lobe to fire. This sheet allows them to get the frontal lobe firing, because now they got to think about it. And when they're thinking, they're using this, and they're able to keep their emotions in control. So here's another one. Here's a full one. And I'm happy to send this to you as well. And I'll let you read it. As you're reading this, the whole purpose of this sheet is to get them to consider a balanced perspective. If they are considering a balanced perspective, they're using their frontal lobe. They're not using their emotions. How this works in real life is that when a student is upset, when you're feeling that they're under distress and it's precluding them from really thinking, don't talk to them through it. Get them to breathe first so they can calm themselves down, and try to work with them. What are you telling yourself? I'm just interested in knowing. It's not saying, oh, come on, it's not that bad, or you coming up with evidence for them. You can help them, but what you would do here is that you give them the sheet and they start doing it themselves. We do this with their parents. This is not therapy. This is just a sheet that we all use so that they begin to internalize these questions, and it becomes a tool that they can use when they start getting themselves up or they start becoming upset. Rather than allowing their emotions to control them, they automatically just start thinking about, what am I telling myself? What's the evidence for? What's the evidence against? And then these follow-up questions kind of flesh that out, so they can come up with a more balanced something to tell themselves that allows them to keep their emotions in control. I'm going to leave you with a couple of other ones, of course. Careful of your own destructive thoughts, as I've mentioned. Challenge your own beliefs. Try to do something like this I just showed you on a daily basis or a weekly basis. It could just be incorporated into your lesson plan. Now, for younger children, they may not recognize the symptoms. And it's no different than us, right? So you want to kind of recognize and help them understand what they are doing. Joey, this is what I see when you become upset. And so that they can understand when you have identified their trigger, they can kind of Take that deep breath. By the way, the deep breathing works for young students too. Now, for older students, you can teach them recognize their own symptoms and triggers, and don't force a student to talk, especially when they're upset, but be there for them. Allow them numerous opportunities through more benign events, communications, and don't be afraid to talk about distress and its effects and what we can do to help. Now the problems can be addressed. And so this is what's happening to our schools who continue to use our systems as well as other curriculum. These are the same schools now that use our system starting in 2019, and you'll see the rates of anxiety, depression, and even ostracism go down well below threshold. That's both for the high schools and the middle schools. And I should also say, this is also true for you. So this is the percentage of educators reporting high levels of adversity across time. Let's look at 2020. 18% of educators reporting high anxiety. It makes sense. That was the throes of the pandemic. But through the course of time, what you see is that it goes down quite a bit. If you can help yourself, you can help your students. And that's the summary I want to say overall. The key to all this is you. And teaching them through you as your own resource is the most important thing we can do to help our students. With that being said, I want to open this up because we are done now, but I want to open this up to any questions you have.
Anyone has any questions, you feel free to drop them in the chat window or the Q&A window.
I see one here. Oh, well, you're welcome. You're most welcome. By the way, we offered this training that I've given you to districts. In fact, I'm doing all of Billings, Montana in 3 weeks, I believe. All of the counselors and social workers in every one of the schools, they're learning this, this protocol. So I'm happy to work with you as well.
Okay, we're just about out of time. As I mentioned at the beginning, I will be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar if you want to watch it again. And for those who were registered but didn't have a chance to log on today, that can be watched after the fact. Also, I will send out a link to a survey. You should also get it right after the webinar has ended. So if you go ahead and give us some feedback on the survey or about this webinar, and if you do complete the survey, you will get a certificate of completion if you need to show that at your school. I wanted to thank you, Rich. Really informative presentation today, and so timely with everything that the world has been going through in the last few years, especially. And thank you to all of our attendees today. So, Rich, is there anything you wanted to wrap up with?
I really appreciate it. And please reach out to me, Rich Gilman at terracemetrics.org, and I'm happy to get you more information about our programs. Rich Gilman, let me put this in here so you can see this. And then I wish you all just a well-deserved break. You all deserve it so much, but this is actually the time to actually practice some of the things that I've taught you today. And if you're interested in continuing on with this program, let me know. Reach out to me directly.
Okay, thanks again, and have a blessed day.
Bye now. Keep
Bye.
breathing.